I'm going to take you on a journey today, and again, it's the stories that we tell, that we share, that have the most impact to our friends, to our families, you know, to other people that we have conversations with, one story at a time, right? My story is a little bit more extreme than maybe some, but we all have a story. We're all seeing how climate change is impacting those of us in Iowa, here in Des Moines. We're seeing, I'm trying to have this confirmed right now, maybe my friend Channing knows, but I think we just had the windiest April or month maybe ever recorded in the state's history. And my wife keeps track of nice days where we can go out and just walk or something. I think we had 15 gales at Okoboji this month. And I'm not kidding when I say that. We had straight line winds, non-storm winds of 65 miles an hour. And so this is becoming more common. We're also having wetter, cooler springs. And as anyone from the agricultural community can tell you right now, it's hard to get out in the fields, isn't it? So weather windows are narrowing for farm work to happen, and that's creating a lot of problems out there in the fields. Farmers have adapted with larger machinery out in the fields and also with tiling. I would say that these are not the best adaptations that we could be making for climate change, but even though they won't say it, they're also adapting to the changing weather patterns. So these are some of the things we're facing in Iowa right now, and of course globally, it's 122 degrees right now in India and Pakistan. And we're already losing 30% of the wheat crop globally to the war in Ukraine. And now the wheat crop in India and Pakistan is also failing. So we're going to have all kinds of supply chain issues and food insecurity issues happening across the globe in this year. And who's to blame? No one's really to blame. Climate change is, we're collectively to blame for how we're adapting or not adapting in building out better resiliency and clean energy systems to adapt as human beings to what we're facing with climate change. So I'm going to begin my presentation, and I'm going to take you on a journey and show you how I went from being an adventurer and a sailor to a water quality and a climate advocate. So this is one of my favorite photos, obviously. Okay, the lights are down. I know you just had lunch, many of you, so keep awake here. I'll try to make it cold, you know, so it'll keep you a little bit anxious. So this photograph was in the Arctic Ocean. It's my favorite photograph I've ever taken. I've taken thousands of images, but it really says to me, it points to the spirituality that I feel when I'm out there deeply into the world's ecology, you know, really out there into the world amongst the elements. So it's spiritual, it's powerful, it's moving, and it shows a little bit of sort of that scare factor that's out there on the ocean too. This was off the coast of Alaska, small craft warning, 35 knots, 15-foot seas, perfect day for sailing. So we're just coming out of Earth Day, right? And 2 years ago, unfortunately, we essentially had Earth Day canceled because of the pandemic, and we should have been out there in the streets celebrating, right? Celebrating some of our achievements, organizing and moving on these issues, and instead we couldn't go out. So we lost a real opportunity there. So 50 years later, we've gone from looking at our little blue marble, right, as a vulnerable planet to now being threatened. We are really at a point of crisis here. The climate crisis is real. Our planet is threatened. Our blue marble, our systems that keep life on this planet is really threatened because of what's happening with increasing greenhouse gases across the globe. So where does your climate story begin? Well, mine begins really with space. My dad was a Marine Corps helicopter pilot, and little did I know it when I was a kid, I didn't understand, but he was involved with the Mercury missions. And the Marine Corps was tasked with picking up the space capsules. Remember when they would plop in the ocean and the helicopters would go pick them up and put them on the aircraft carriers? That's what my dad was doing. And so I was literally born into the race for space and also seeing the planet for the first time from afar. And little did I know the impact that that was going to have on my life. So that's really where my story begins. But it continued on after moving from California as a kid back to Iowa, where my parents were from, and eventually to Okoboji. And so this is really the formation of my story, and something I speak about a lot now, the Okoboji Model, because we've essentially been building out what we voted for 12 years ago, the IWIL program, to fund a recreational outdoor tourism and water quality trust fund to improve those things in Iowa for all of us so we can get outside and enjoy more public spaces and clean water. And once you're involved with getting outside, experiencing nature, and being involved with local conservation groups and stewardship, you go deeper and deeper in your involvement, and guess what? That connects perfectly with climate. And that's what I found with my work. At Okoboji, we love to ride our bikes around the lakes. We have extensive trail systems. We ride around the lakes through tall grass prairie systems. It's beautiful. And one thing I noticed during COVID, the last 2 years, was that there's winners and losers in outdoor recreation. You have a wonderful area here in Des Moines. You've built a lot of trails. You have wonderful parks and recreational opportunities. But you go out into rural Iowa, in a lot of places, there is nothing. There is nothing natural left out there anymore. There's no parks or clean water or public spaces for people to participate. We've been overrun at Okoboji in the lakes area because we've done a good job of investing, but a lot of people don't have these resources. So this is my world that I grew up in, photographing nature, all the birds, the beautiful wildlife that migrates through, getting out in kayaks, long water swims that we have, and triathlons and paddleboarding and good outdoor, solid, healthy recreation. And a $300 million tourism industry that's developed in a rural county in the state of Iowa. Imagine that. Something other than an agricultural-based system. So I'm a big proponent for adding more outdoor recreational opportunities, public lands, and clean water to the state to diversify our economy and keep young people in the state as a form of economic development. Let's use our natural resources, enhance and restore them. This is what we do. Yeah, thank you. We need to build more resilient infrastructure. We're having more 6, 7, 8-inch rains now, right? We need to be restoring wetlands as resilient infrastructure to buffer our natural systems so that they become thriving wetlands. The wetlands are beautiful for looking at wildlife, adding trails, added value to your communities. This is what we're doing again. Adding prairie strips around our agricultural fields, and then running recreational trails through the prairie strips. To have pollinators. You can't believe, this is a friend's field in Spirit Lake. He's added 20% of his land, his agricultural land, into prairie strips now, and it's become one of the most popular places in the lakes area for people to bike and look at wildlife and pollinators and beautiful plants. So Arnold's Park Amusement Park, how many people have been there throughout the years? Yeah, a lot of you. A lot of people have met there and gotten married at Arnold's Park, by the way. Well, I was tasked when I was on the board there, when I was on the city council in Okoboji, to help design a new parking lot with zero runoff. And that's what we did. We have a 600-car parking lot there now that's surrounded with bioswales and rain gardens. And guess what? Zero water runoff into the lake. So we're not only preventing pollution from that parking lot, there's also thermal pollution from parking lots that goes into natural water resources that causes big impacts too. So these are things that we're doing. We also have a lot of demonstrations out there with cover crops, no-till, agriculture. We have a Prairie Lake Conference there, and we have, I don't know, one of the few, if not the only, water quality festivals with over 40 exhibitors in the lakes area and a big concert to celebrate water quality and what we're doing in the lakes. And this is a model that I think needs to be exported throughout the state of Iowa to help with economic development and to develop more conservation and stewardship across the state. And once we add that with already 57% of our wind energy, right? Guess what? We're in business, aren't we? All we have to do is add 43% solar and storage, and we could be the first net zero state in the United States. We should be touting our success of 57% wind energy, and I don't even hear any candidate talking about that from the right or the left. We need to be celebrating these accomplishments of what we're doing to be ahead of the game here in Iowa. Wind energy is hardly even controversial anymore, is it? We need to make solar energy the same way. It is 35 times more efficient at producing energy per acre than ethanol. From industrial corn to ethanol, solar is 35 times more efficient per acre. Think about that as this conversation progresses with carbon sequestration pipelines, okay? Which are a scam, by the way. We can talk about that later. So in Iowa, we're having wetter, cooler springs, as this month attests to, right? More heavy rain events. This is part of the cycle. This is causing major erosion problems, whether it's in urban development or out in the fields. We're losing on average of 5 tons of the best topsoil in the world per acre annually. 5 tons of topsoil per acre. And this is all going into our waters across the state of Iowa. Fouling our waters, it hurts tourism, it hurts our area in Okoboji when this happens, so we keep building out more resilience. And anyone want to go swimming there? We have 800 impaired bodies of water across the state of Iowa, and we have 35 outstanding waters in the state for 3.5 million people. That's not a very good formula for success. And it all goes downstream, and of course, we have 52 watersheds in the state of Iowa. I happen to live up there in the northwest corner, right, in a small watershed that's in the Little Sioux River. Because of the CAFO development up there in northwest Iowa, we have the equivalent of 8 million people living in our watershed with the amount of effluent and nutrients that are flowing into the Little Sioux River basin. It's one of the most polluted river systems in the country. And of course, this all flows into the Mississippi River system. Mississippi River system was just voted as one of the top 10 most endangered river systems in the United States. So here we are. This is the cycle we're in. And once you connect water with climate, you understand the deep, deep problems that we face right now in trying to correct this. And this is why it's so important to think about the cycle and how we can work together to break this cycle. So back to Okoboji and this beautiful lake, one of the outstanding lakes, West Okoboji in the state of Iowa, is where I learned to sail as a little boy. And they still race these little boats, the X-boat that I learned to sail on. This is my mother teaching me how to sail. When I was a little boy, you can barely see the name on the back. It said help upside down, so that when I flipped over, you know, it would be help. And that's how I grew up sailing, and believe me, I needed that help many times when I was a little kid. And they still race these little boats. This is a regatta at Okoboji. It's one of the unknown sports in the state of Iowa. We have, last year we held the Inland Lakes National Championships at Okoboji. We had over 200 sailboats there. It was beautiful, and people love sailing. This is me sailing with my nephews. I was talking with a friend, sailor friend from Okoboji here earlier, and during the last couple of years, I got a sea scow and sailed with my nephews during COVID because it was one of the things that we could do during this time when we couldn't be out socializing. So I got to sail with my 2 sisters, my brother, and my 3 nephews during this time over the last couple of years, and it was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had in life. Of course, sailing is beautiful. I started documenting sailing and working with a number of publications early on, and it was my love of sailing, love of photography, my interest in adventure that eventually took me to the ocean. Well, a lot of people ask me, you know, like, David, you're from Iowa, for gosh sakes. How in the world did you ever get out to the ocean sailing? And the answer comes to me easily. I met a southern Minnesota hog farmer, and the rest was history. And I'm not kidding when I say that. This is Roger Swanson, my great mentor and friend. Unfortunately, he's passed away now, but he sailed over 200,000 miles around the planet and grew up and lived on the southern Minnesota farm, Century Farm, in a town named Donnell with a population of 117 people. And he turned out to be one of the greatest American sailors in history and has been receiving accolades throughout his entire career, the Blue Water Medal, and was recently recognized as being the finest offshore American voyager of his time. So little did I know when I was connecting with Roger that I was going to have this crazy famous sailing mentor right there 35 miles from Okoboji. This was his sailboat Cloud 9. She's a ketch, 2 masts, flew 4 sails when we sailed. We carried 17 sails with us, always backups for every condition that we faced. You can see meticulously kept, everything perfect. Roger was a navigator on his destroyer, and so as an old Navy seaman, we were always shipshape and ready to go for sure. So together, he taught me how to sail all over the planet. This is sailing across the Atlantic on my first voyage in 1991, 3 decades ago. My first time sailing on the ocean was a 6,000-mile, 38-day voyage across the South Atlantic from Cape Town, South Africa, to Ushuaia, Argentina. And I loved it. Obviously, I was hanging upside down from atop the mast 100 feet off the ocean in the middle of the South Atlantic. And I was clinging to the mast so hard, upside down like this, cross-legged, that when I got down, I noticed I didn't have any hair left on the inside of my legs. So I was pretty bruised up from that debacle, but I learned quite a bit about doing photography in extreme conditions. And of course, sailing to some of these remote places on the planet was where I really started understanding the great weather and climate systems and how these things started connecting. And of course, people always said, David, how did you train to go on these crazy sailing adventures in the cold? And I went, have you ever spent a winter in Northwest Iowa? Like, seriously. You know, people always ask from other parts, California or New York or wherever I'm speaking or something, and they don't really understand Iowa. You know, we're pretty hardy souls here. We're pretty tough, and we're pretty humble folks, but we're pretty tough people here in the state of Iowa. So this is me sailing in Antarctica. Of course, the great weather systems, you see all kinds of things out there in the ocean. This is a roll cloud. This was a cold front that was approaching, and on one side of the front, it was about 65 degrees, and on the back side it was about 45. And we were entering the gate, so to speak, into the roaring 40s and heading down to the cold parts of the planet. And of course, these are the oceans that you face when you're out there. You feel very, very humbled and small. Even though I was on a 57-foot sailboat or a 65-foot sailboat, you are just a little tiny speck that can be knocked off the face of the earth at any time. So these were seas that were 35 feet or so. They look like mountains, and they feel like mountains out there. They're very, very dangerous, and you have to use all of your skills all the time to stay alive out there in these conditions and work as a team. So, you know, teamwork, trust, all of these things. You know, I speak to a lot of business people about team building and trust and how you accomplish goals. This was all about what we did when we were out there, working hard to achieve, getting from A to B, survive and advance, B to C, and just keep going until you achieve your goal on a day-to-day basis. So 3 decades ago, I sailed to Antarctica. We sailed below the Antarctic Circle and became the first American sailing vessel in history to sail below the Antarctic Circle. We felt pretty good about that accomplishment. We got kicked around pretty good down there, lost all of our instruments. We had seas up to 40 feet, in ice a lot, and nearly lost our vessel. We lost all of our electronics, all of our heat, and at one point we were in this mess. The warmest we could get our boat was 37 degrees, and we were soaking wet. We couldn't get our clothes dried. We had head contusions and all kinds of things that happen, and this is what happens in these extreme places, survive and advance. But the goal, you know, was to get down there, see the wildlife, spend time with scientists. And this was the first time I really did get to spend time with scientists in extreme parts of the field, document the voyage, and write stories about it. And I just love doing this with the scientific community. So this is when I kind of started becoming a citizen scientist. And it was while we were sitting in these remote places. Of course, we're a little speck there on the lower left, right? in this vast, vast complex of glaciers and icebergs. And we were thinking about what's next. We're at the southern end of the Earth, and Roger's already thinking about sailing to the north end of the world. He was always that way, inspiring us to think out further. So we started thinking about the Northwest Passage at the time. And so 2 years later, after being in Antarctica, by the way, you see the glacier that's in the background there. I had to climb up the glacier that I'm standing on to get that picture. Now I would just launch my drone, right? So I didn't have these tools back then. I'm really envious of all these youngsters that are out there flying drones around in these remote places these days. So it's a little bit easier. So we were already thinking about the Northwest Passage, and this is the Arctic Ocean that I really want to talk about right now in the Northwest Passage, where my climate story really takes hold. So as you can see, the Northwest Passage, I'm going to start from the right side of your screen and move to the left, so Atlantic to Pacific, because this is the classic east to west passage. We started in the Canadian Maritimes, out into the Atlantic Ocean, up the west coast of Greenland, across Baffin Bay. You're now 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and through the archipelago of Canadian islands there, over the top of Alaska, and then if you're lucky enough, you go through the Bering Strait, back across the Arctic Circle, and eventually through the Aleutians and out into the Pacific. It's some 7,000 miles. It had never been done by an American sailing vessel in history. We were doing Amundsen's route, my exploring hero. We were trying to follow his route through, which he had done 100 years before us. So here's what the route looks like. This is an old video from Iowa Public Television. So here you go, through Baffin Bay, across Baffin Bay now, into Lancaster Sound. The Northwest Passage begins. Now you head south through these channels and islands, and then over the top of the North American continent, eventually over Alaska, through the Aleutian Islands and out. And this is kind of what it looks like beating along. My bunk, by the way, was right under the little dinghy there in the bow of the boat. So you can imagine what it's like trying to sleep aboard. Your stomach kind of leaves you, you're pulling big G's. It's very similar to being in a space capsule, from what I understand. So in 1994, off we go, right? Scary, dangerous, slippery conditions all the time. It's snowing, there's ice on board. We were told that if we went overboard, we were dead, because there's no way you can turn around a 25-ton vessel and get back to anybody in the water in time. So death was always just a few feet away. And that scared us enough so that no one did, believe me. Once you get to Greenland, beautiful blue ice, and this is the awe, this is the wonder and majesty that I really wanted to experience at the time, to document the beauty of this planet, bring back stories, bring back photographs to kind of inspire people, and to get out there to places that I'd never been and try to gather these images. I wasn't necessarily thinking so much about climate change yet at this point in my life. So up we go. The warm current along the west coast of Greenland started pushing the ice away. We had to navigate through these bergy bits as we moved up north, waiting for the summer ice to clear. We could get up close and personal to icebergs. You can kind of see the scale of things in this image. You can also see on top of that iceberg, I was always mad because I was like, I want to see the pristine white ice. What is all this dirt and crud all over these icebergs? Guess what that is? That is black carbon pollution. This is industrial soot that has been transported across the globe and has been the triggering mechanism that started the positive feedback loop that is now melting the glacial ice, especially, glacial ice mostly in the south, mostly sea ice in the north, because the Arctic Ocean is an ocean, right? Antarctica is a continent, so it's a whole different kind of thing going on in the southern sphere. So in the north, you're seeing all this industrial soot, and maybe you've seen this in pictures now, but the black on the white ice absorbs the sun's energy as heat, and that melts the ice into water. And guess what? More darkness absorbs more heat, which melts more ice. It pulls ice away from the shorelines, which opens more dark water, which absorbs more energy as heat, which melts more ice, which opens more water, which diminishes the ice coverage in the Arctic. So this positive feedback loop, or what's called libido, has been going on now for, I don't know, 5 or 6 decades, but it's really started to progress in the last couple during the time when I was there in the Arctic. We were visiting these beautiful little towns in Greenland where I would visit with local people about what they were doing, how they were living, what it was like to live in this remote part of the world. 2/3 the size of the United States with only 50,000 people living there. No roads to speak of except in communities. You could only travel in the summer by ferry or by dog sled or snow machine in the wintertime. Again, this is as far north as we got. We're up close and personal with the icebergs. This is the summer high wet pressure system. You get these sunny 24-hour days where you can travel. You can see in the background there's a rock outcropping there. That's called Devil's Thumb. It's a local landmark, and this is where the local fishermen knew that the sea ice would start splitting in Baffin Bay between the northern fixed pack ice and where the summer melt would melt and open up a lead right across Baffin Bay where you could sail over to Canada. So we took their advice. Remember, this is pre-internet or just evolving internet. We didn't really have those kinds of communications on board yet. We were going by kind of seat of the pants, old-fashioned, old-school navigation, and also exploring paper charts and sextants and the whole works. Again, we're sailing across Baffin Bay now, the rough weather sailing. In the red coat is Roger Swanson, and in the yellow coat is an 81-year-old explorer that was with us, Jeff Pope. Can you imagine? 81 years old, sailing across Baffin Bay and going through the Northwest Passage with us. Jeff Pope was one of the greatest explorers that no one has ever heard of in the United States, and I can tell you more about him afterwards. Rough seas, but no ice. We hit it perfectly and sailed right across in a really fast passage and into the Northwest Passage. This is our actual chart. From the right is Greenland, over to the left into Lancaster Sound there in the middle. We entered the Northwest Passage. And we were greeted by these magnificent lenticular clouds, and we knew that we were not in for a great summer sailing sort of expedition. We knew we were in for a wild, wild time, and yes, we were. Lots of quickly changing conditions and lots of wind, and of course, the history of the Northwest Passage with folks like the Franklin expedition who were right there and overwintered, frozen into the ice there in 1843. Of course, all 129 men would die on that expedition. British expedition, typical, 2 ships, the Erebus and Terror. They were too large of ships to navigate in the ice. They had too many men, they had bad food and poor clothing. So, as I would say, a typical British expedition. So it failed, and they did not adapt to the ways of the Arctic. They refused help from the indigenous people of the north who offered them assistance and help, and especially with food. These are the first 3 graves of the first 3 crew members who died on that epic voyage, fateful voyage. You'll see a second vessel there in that photograph. We didn't know it at the time. Again, not very good communications, but there was a smaller vessel, the blue one there, called Back of the Moon, and there were 3 French sailors aboard with us, or aboard on their vessel. So in 1994, there were exactly 2 boats and 9 people attempting the Northwest Passage in 94 in the entire world. As I would say, more people summit Mount Everest every year than have ever been through the Northwest Passage in history. So this was the Franklin expedition, right? Not very nimble vessel. Of course, ice conditions were much less favorable back then too. They had a horrific time, but it ended up inspiring other people to come to the Northwest Passage, find out what happened to them, and eventually Amundsen went through in 1903 to 1906. We thought the same thing was going to happen to us. We were trapped in the ice in a horrible way. We thought we were going to get crushed numerous times. In every expedition, there's a go and a no-go date, and we had set our date toward the end of August for trying to get through the ice and proceed into the southern channels, and we were hitting that critical time, and we tried every which way to get through this pack ice. You would have needed an icebreaker to get through there, not a 57-foot fiberglass vessel. So at a certain point, after nearly being crushed numerous times for 2 weeks straight, we had to retreat, and we had to find a way back out of that ice and get out of there before we got frozen into the ice and had to spend the entire winter there in a bad position. So we drifted with the ice, we got separated with our French friends on back of the moon. It was very scary, difficult time for us. We had go bags packed all the time, so if we needed to, we could send out a mayday and hop on the pack ice while Cloud 9 was getting crushed, and the Canadian Coast Guard would pick us up. So it was a pretty treacherous time. You can see from the photographs here that we were in and out of this ice constantly, and finally we had to retreat. So 3,000 miles all the way back out in the same way that we came in, and as I like to say, the Northwest Passage won again. So that was 1994. Let's fast forward 13 years. The internet happened, technology happened, all of a sudden all this knowledge about climate change happened, and instead of it being keyholed or siloed up into institutions where you couldn't get it before the internet, all of a sudden I was getting satellite data, and all this science from various institutions was becoming available to me, and I was starting to read constantly about the loss of ice in the Arctic. Scientists were saying it's alarming, and a lot of people were starting to doubt that it was really happening. You know, what's really going on in the Arctic? So in 2007, Roger was now 75 years old, and he wanted to go back one more time. This was the one feather in his cap, the sailing triumph that he really wanted to go through the Northwest Passage. That was his motivation. Mine was to go there and ground truth what the scientists were saying, that there is an Arctic death spiral going on with the loss of ice. And they were trumpeting this. And I said, okay, I believe this is happening, but I want to go see it for myself. So in 2007, I went back with that intention to document what was happening at the northern polar region of the world. So there we go again, right? Back to Greenland, up the west coast of Greenland. Beautiful little towns here like Upernavik where we could provision for the last time, see some friends like these Norwegian sailors. There were now, by the way, 64 research vessels working in Greenland studying this issue of climate change in all various aspects. So we went from a small number of people to a great number of climate scientists around the world looking at what was going on with receding glaciers and what was happening with the melt-off in this region. We were working on our radar also. We needed radar to see the big icebergs because it's very foggy a lot of times. You can't visually see them. They hide in the fog, and believe me, you don't want to T-bone an iceberg. So that's one of our crew members, Chris, who was up there working on the radar, getting it ready for the voyage across. And as you can see, this is what we had most of the way. Across Baffin Bay, there was no sea ice. It had completely disappeared from all of Baffin Bay. We didn't really have to worry about sea ice, but we did have to worry about icebergs, and we couldn't see them visually, so we needed our radar. We entered Lancaster Sound, same way we went in 1994, and what's missing from this picture? Zero ice. There wasn't just a little less ice, there was zero sea ice. It was gone. It had completely disappeared, and we were absolutely profoundly dumbfounded by what we were seeing. And then we went back to the exact same place where we were stuck in the ice in 1994. We crossed our path on our chart. It's in my book. You'll see it. We crossed our path on the same day, 13 years removed, and there was no ice there in the same place. It was just like summer sailing in Okoboji. And so we proceeded. Now we could get through into the southern channels that we couldn't get to before, but we knew something had profoundly changed and we were witnessing something historical. The polar bears were wondering too, because instead of swimming after the sea ice, right, where the seals lived, that ice was gone. So now we were seeing more polar bears on the land, and they were having to forage for food in different ways. Now we're sailing south in these open channels with less ice. We're following Amundsen, my exploring hero. I read all of his books. I even tried to live like he did as a crazy young adventurer. I tore my cabin apart at Okoboji barehanded all winter long to prepare for the 1994 trip. I slept with the windows open with no heat on, and brought in all my own water and all that kind of stuff, and just to kind of toughen up for the voyages. Us crazy Iowans, we do crazy stuff. So we ended up going to the same place where he was, named Joa Haven. And this is where he decided, deep into the voyage, they spotted this beautiful, as they called, the finest little harbor in the world, and they plopped anchored there, and they froze in for the winter. And guess what we did? We anchored in the exact same place as Amundsen did 100 years later in this village where they hardly ever saw other vessels sailing into. So we got to meet lots of folks from the community. It was very inspiring, and again, to learn from the indigenous people in a remote place how they were living in these areas was absolutely fascinating. Again, I can share more afterwards about this. So we proceeded all the way through the Northwest Passage, some 6,694 miles, to be somewhat exact, and we never touched one piece of ice in the process. We did this in 73 days, and compare that to Amundsen taking 4 years and 3 years frozen into the ice. This is how much the Arctic has changed just in a short period of time. We became the first American sailors ever to do this east-west, northwest passage, and we were very, very proud of this accomplishment and honored by it, but I knew that we got an assist from a changing climate. And how much did it change? Well, I'm not going to, bore you with a whole bunch of stats and such, but this is what's happened to the Arctic just since Earth Day, 50 years ago, right? The Arctic, the northern areas of Alaska, have now increased in temperature 9 degrees. Think of that. What's the difference between 32 and 33, right? Ice to water. Well, this is now 9 degrees that they're seeing up there. It's the fastest warming place on the planet, and it is changing everything in the far north. You think about the indigenous communities up there, it's creating all kinds of food insecurity issues. And we start talking about climate justice, it needs to start in a lot of these remote places, and especially with indigenous people who are feeling these changes the most. Warming oceans. You can see the line. It's going pretty much at an angle, not quite straight up, but it's progressing at a rate that is melting sea ice. The ocean is also expanding thermally. As the ocean gets warmer, it expands. So we have warming oceans and warming expansion, right? Plus melting ice, glacial ice, that's causing sea level rise. And now think about the 5 billion people that are living within 100 miles of the ocean and the problems we face not far into the future. And of course, here's the Arctic death spiral, decade by decade by decade. So in my short career, I have now witnessed a 50% loss of sea ice in our northern pole region. Think about that in 3 decades. If we were looking at another planet that was losing its northern pole, our North Pole is being lost to us in our lifetimes. The North Pole that we grew up thinking of, this remote area, fierce, nasty, sea ice, cold, we're going to have a blue water moment with no sea ice coming soon. Think about that in the Arctic Ocean. So all of this got me more interested in climate science, obviously, and I literally had just finished the 2007 Northwest Passage, and I got a call on my phone sitting on a bench in Alaska when we were finished and kind of putting Cloud 9 away on Kodiak Island, and it was Mark Schrader, who was the director of a project called Around the Americas. And he said, "Hey, David, I've been following your voyage through the Northwest Passage. It looks amazing." I had been blogging, and the Wall Street Journal had picked up my blog, and it created this whole crazy viral thing at the time. And so a lot of people were following this voyage. And he said, "How would you like to go through the Northwest Passage again?" And I went, "Oh my, I'm not sure right now if I really feel like that." He goes, "Don't worry, it's not until 2009. You got some time to think about it." And I said, I'm in, I'm in. Just give me a little time to recover from this. So I got involved with the Around the Americas expedition, a program that was really put together by David Rockefeller and the Pew Oceans Commission, a number of folks who were really interested in oceans, ocean chemistry, climate change, all these issues that were affecting the oceans of the world and how humans were having this big impact. And so I became involved as the documentary photographer and videographer and also the ice expert for the voyage in some of these remote areas where we would go. There would be 4 sailors that would do the entire voyage, and then there would be dozens of scientists that we would have on board. We worked with scientific institutions in both hemispheres, North and South America, and we worked with multiple institutions like MIT and Scripps and too many schools to name, but it was just fantastic working with all these folks. In between, I got to lecture at the first ever World Science Festival in New York City with Sylvia Earle, who's one of the more prominent oceanographers in the world, and also with Richard Leakey on some pretty serious issues like extinction. And some of my crew members were there and lots of folks. And again, it just helped me as a climate science communicator really start developing my skills. So I've been working on this now for 15 straight years with climate communication, telling the story, and trying to help folks understand the seriousness and gravity of this issue that we face. So off we went. We were doing science, working with kids. There I am giving a book out on the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid in New York City. So we were trying to inspire children. We were doing, obviously, climate change work. We were doing Arctic buoy retrieval. So we were launching Arctic buoys. We were also retrieving Arctic buoys for the International Arctic Buoy System. We were also working on sea life. We had a Google camera on board that was taking 10,000 images a day, every single day. And then we would take this information back to the Applied Physics Lab at the University of Washington, since we were based out of Seattle. So that's some of the science we were doing. We had carbon fiber kayaks. We had high technology, sat phones and satellite technology. We had a full array on top. We were the smallest ocean-going weather NOAA ship in the world. So we were fully equipped. We had a NOAA oceanographer with us the whole time. We were also educating kids. Whole idea was to inspire kids in both hemispheres to maybe become the next educator or scientist who could help solve some of these problems that we face. So we had a whole program designed by the National Science Foundation, and we were meeting with kids everywhere we went. So this is Ocean Watch. We had this beautiful spinnaker we would fly. These are the conditions I worked in on a day-to-day basis. You can see there's a blue cord sort of running down the side of the ship. I wore, the sailing vessel, I had a harness that I wore all the time with a carabiner attached to me and a tether with another carabiner. So all the time I would be clipped into a harness and I would run this zip line around the vessel or clip into the mast or wherever I was working so that I could shoot pictures. And I promised my wife that I would never take it off. So, because you can see from the conditions there, right? This is not a static environment. This is rock and roll for sure. We got up to Alaska, so I'll make a couple points and then we'll go to some Q&A here, a couple stories. So this is nearing Barrow, Alaska. Now it's called Tuktoyaktuk because they're using indigenous names. We had a little bit of sea ice there, but you can see the open lead and then the point of land that's just off the bow there that Herb was looking at through the binoculars on the bow. So in Barrow, we started seeing the effects of climate change right away. And of course, the main effect there is that the permafrost is melting and it's creating great instability in these villages that are built right on the seashore. So you have sea level rise, you have all the ice melting, so you have shallow water systems there. The wind will blow for days and it pushes water. It starts piling water up. So they're having storm surge, sea level rise, great action, permafrost melt, and it's tearing their shorelines apart everywhere in these coastal communities in Alaska, Siberia, anywhere in the far north. So they're having to build out resilient infrastructure, which is the catchphrase of the day, right? We need it in Iowa, they need it in the Arctic, we need it pretty much everywhere. Their shorelines are being ripped apart. Migratory corridors are under threat. Food insecurity issues in the far north, because the water's warming, the sea ice is changing, and so the migratory patterns are also changing. So the indigenous elders there in these communities cannot communicate their oral histories anymore with any accuracy because the animals are showing up at different times or they're not showing up at all. And then going out and hunting these animals for subsistence sort of living like they do is becoming dangerous and unpredictable for families that need this food out there. So I met these two, one scientist on the right, Craig George, and then Harry Brower on the left, who was the whaling captain there, and they told me about the Bowhead Whale. And again, it's all in my book, and you can read about it online. There's plenty of stories, but the Bowhead Whale was brought back in one of the great conservation stories of history with scientists working with the indigenous community to bring back the bowhead whale from the brink of extinction. And they're now thriving, but they were nearly hunted to extinction during the Yankee whaling fleet days of the 18th and 19th centuries. So these two guys worked with the entire community. Of course, they harvest whales, and that's one of the ways that they feed their communities in the summertime. These are bowhead whales migrating through that corridor. And one of the things that we've been fighting in the north is oil and gas exploration just offshore, because it's very shallow there. We were sailing through 40 to 60 feet of water, so it's very easy to build these oil eye lines where you can drill. But one spill in the Chukchi, Beaufort Sea areas, and it's extinction level events. I mean, it would wipe out the entire corridor. Remember, you're only 50 miles between Russia and the United States in the Bering Strait area. So there's not a lot of room for these animals to operate, and millions of animals migrate through these areas. This is George DeVoke, an ornithologist who lived on this little island, Cooper Island. He's been there, I think this is his 47th straight year this summer, and he lives alone there, so he was really happy to see us. We brought him a whole lot of gear and supplies, so we did an interview with him. I was shooting the film, and my friend Herb was interviewing him. He asked him one question, and he talked for an hour and 10 minutes. And Herb said, mate, because Herb's kind of Aussie also, and he's like, mate, this is the easiest interview I've ever done. And so he told us a lot of stories about his birds. He lives on this, again, this little uninhabited island 30 miles off the coastline of Alaska. He lived in the yellow tent for a long time, and he had to move into the cabin there. After 28 years living on the island, he had never seen a polar bear, but all of a sudden the polar bear started swimming. He'd never seen one, and all of a sudden the polar bears were swimming out to that island, and they started eating his birds and eating the eggs and tried to eat him. So he decided he better move into this bear-proof cabin, which he lives now in the summertime. These are his little birds he studies, the black guillemot. And when he was a young scientist, he went out there and he discovered the black guillemot living under these old World War II and Korean pillboxes that we left on shore there, the wood boxes, and the birds started nesting and living under these boxes, and he went, aha, this is my thesis project. And so he studied these little black guillemots. Well, after a couple decades there, he found that their breeding season was extended. And by how much? Well, he needed to study that. And he found out that it was 5 days per decade. And he's like, what on earth is causing this? They're picking up on a signal that humans are not capable of picking up on. So he started to look for the correlations for the signal. And what he discovered was it correlated exactly to 5 days earlier per season that the snow and ice was melting from the shores of Arctic Alaska. So that's what was happening. So, and again, the polar bears were swimming because they needed to get further offshore to find the ice edge, because that's where the seals were living. So that's why they were swimming to his island and trying to eat George and eat his birds. So his research has changed quite a lot in the last few years. Onward we went. That's me up on the mast. We went through a little ice. We had about 60 miles of sea ice that we had to navigate through. So we had to be really careful because we had a lot of instruments that were going through the hull on Ocean Watch. And a lot of the ice has shells underneath the water, so they could trip some of our instruments, and they went right through the hull into the vessel. So we had to be careful in the sea ice, which was really fun to be in. We went to another community called Tuktoyaktuk, where I met another friend here in the Arctic. This is an indigenous hunter and fisherman, and he had just caught beluga whale, which he had cleaned out, and he was catching these whitefish, and this was going to be his family's meals for the entire winter. So I spent an entire day with him before I took a picture because I had to earn his trust and kind of befriend him and make sure he knew that I meant well. So I spent all these couple days with him, watching him clean fish, listening to him tell stories, and he would make this, what he called bipsy. It's a stew, and it was raw beluga whale and whitefish and all the oil and guts and everything else, and every once in a while he would just dip that knife in and he would just stick it right in my face, and I'd have to go like that, and I didn't know what to do with it. At first I tried to chew it, it was like chewing on a car tire. You're not supposed to chew it, so I would sit there and go, but you're supposed to just swallow it. And I hadn't quite figured that out. I sort of had the gag reflex and turned yellow and green and everything else, and he started laughing, and we became friends, so I earned his trust, and therefore I got to go to the ice cave. And so this is 30 feet underground in permafrost. It's a Permacross Ice Cave, and this is the natural refrigerator system in the Arctic. So there's 19 rooms. Each family who wanted to hunt and fish traditionally could keep their food in these caves for the season. So while we were down there, Wayne was telling me all kinds of stories again about how for hundreds and hundreds of years his family has been doing the exact same thing there in the Arctic. And there's records of these people living there for some 40,000 years, doing the same thing, hunting and fishing, using these natural systems, following the caribou migration, gathering their food in a systematic way, predictable way over the centuries and over millennia. So this is what they're facing now with the melting of these permafrost ice caves along these Arctic village areas. They're losing their natural refrigeration systems. And therefore, look what's happening. This is now the food that they're getting in these remote areas. So the kids and families, instead of getting this high quality natural food that their bodies have adapted to for thousands of years, are now having potato chips and sodas. And so they're having high incidences of diabetes and at very young age, and also lots of obesity issues, and they don't have any doctors in these villages. They're lucky if a doctor visits a village once a year. So this is what they're facing, a lot of food insecurity, lots of issues. This is sort of the climate justice kind of issue that we're talking about a lot. And of course, you can look in these villages and see the problems. They live very primitively in makeshift sort of cabins that they've built up there. The Canadian government helps a lot, as does the U.S. government, but it's really hard in these areas. And a lot of times the homes are moving around because the permafrost is shifting so much. And these houses and businesses are falling into the ocean if they're too close to the sea now. So lots of problems we learned about as we traveled. Through the Northwest Passage we went. Of course, a little bit of ice here and there, but we didn't have any problem. We carried extra fuel to travel on what we called these halcyon days, these sunny, beautiful, majestic, wonderful days that we were experiencing in the Arctic. We were meeting other explorers, like Kevin Tony here, that they were British Special Forces guys that were on holiday from the war in Afghanistan, and they thought it would be a jolly good time to take an open, small boat 17 feet through the Northwest Passage. They had almost just been killed by a bear on shore, and they were telling the story and regaling all of this. It was 26 degrees, and you can see they're in flip-flops and Crocs. And so these are the kind of characters you meet in the Arctic. You could never meet them otherwise, right? You could advertise or lay traps for them, and you could never catch them. But they just show up in the Arctic. It's kind of amazing. So we had a lot of fun with them. We brought them to Ocean Watch, and Kevin was he was really funny because in Ocean Watch you come off the deck and you crawl down a companionway and into our main area where we would eat. It's called a saloon, and so he crawled down the companionway and his socks fell out of his armpits. He'd been warming up his socks the whole time in his underarms, and he'd forgotten when he crawled down the companionway his socks fell down, and so that's how they were kind of trying to keep warm out there. So anyway, tough guys, tough women. There's a lot of folks up there doing crazy stuff. But I really wanted to go out, and I'll kind of close on some of these thoughts, but I really wanted to go out and venture into the world for the beauty of this planet. I mean, that's what drew me out there with my camera as a visual artist. I wanted to get pictures that nobody else was getting. I wanted to have experiences and stories that no one else could obtain. And that's what drew me to Roger, and that's what drew me to these remote places on the planet. I found them inspiring, and I wanted to bring back the stories. So I didn't go out to look for climate change. Climate change found me as I was looking for something in life to inspire me. I found when I wasn't looking for, it was like the butterfly landing on my shoulder, right? It was sort of this, wow. All these years I was looking for this, looking for something. I didn't know what I was looking for. And then in 2007, I went through the Northwest Passage and never touched a piece of ice. And this was the moment that I knew that I was witnessing planetary change. Something was happening that the world needed to know about, and I could help tell my story and do my little part. And this is what we all need to do now. And it was beauty, the beauty of this planet, the awe that inspired me to go out there, to see the majestic icebergs. People always ask me, didn't you get tired of photographing ice and cold? I'm like, look at this, really? You know, no way. It's unbelievable. And I want other young explorers to have the same kind of opportunity to go to these special places. And I'm hoping that we'll do a good job in the next 10 to 20 years of making these transitions into the type of clean energy, being good stewards, more caring, looking out for others, kinder, gentler human beings in every way, to the other, to ourselves, to our families. And as we were going through the Northwest Passage, it really dawned on me, because I hadn't really thought a lot about it with on Ocean Watch, because I was going from west to east in this time, that I had become the only American sailor, the first and only American sailor to ever do the Northwest Passage in both directions. And that I was a witness to something and a bridge to these changes and eras, like this golden era of exploration, Amundsen's and Shackleton and some of these great explorers that I had read about. You know, it was about guts and glory and, a lot of this kind of stuff. And for me, I was a bridge to this new era, that it wasn't good enough to just go out and take pictures and bring back some stories, right? We now had to be communicators about what we were seeing, about these changes to planetary history. And that's the new era that we're living in. We're living in the era of climate change, in the Anthropocene, or the era of humans now, right? We control our own destiny. This is what's important now, that we take the time, have the conversations, make hard choices, and make these things happen. And I'll tell you just one last story in closing, because I went back in 2018 to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on a campaign with the International League of Conservation Photographers. And I was going to spend a lot of time with indigenous people. I had sailed past this region for many times, but drilling has been a constant battle there. This is the most pristine wilderness left on the planet. This is our Serengeti. It's the home of the Porcupine Caribou, the largest migratory herd of mammals left on the planet. This is the area of the Canyon River Valley. This river flows north to the Arctic Ocean. It's one of the most spectacular, beautiful places I had ever witnessed. And I got to see up close the migration of one of the greatest herds of animals on the planet, the Porcupine Caribou. And it was profoundly impactful to my life to witness this, to see this, and go to a place, and this goes back to what we're talking about. The Gwich'in people of the far north call this the sacred place where life begins. This is the calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou, with a herd of some 300,000 that have been doing this route in and out of the Brooks Range for 40,000, 50,000, 200,000 years, every year predictably. And all of a sudden, it's not predictable anymore. The people that depend on these animals, that have done this and lived this way for thousands and thousands of years, are being profoundly changed by the impact that they're seeing with climate change. And so in this special area, the land of the northern lights, of the aurora, is a place where I got to meet some of these people. This is Mary Jane Moses. If ever there was to be development in the calving grounds, our communities would be affected in a really bad way. The caribou is our food. It's our main source of food. If we don't have the caribou, what other options do we really have? This is climate justice. This is what's happening, our impacts in far places across the globe with people that are being so affected. And one last thought here. This is what this young chief, Dana Tisnatram, who I met and had wonderful conversations with, if this doesn't get you, I don't know what will. If we can't come together over this, if climate change can't bring us together to fulfill the dreams of our ancestors, then we have no business being on this planet anymore. They've lived in harmony with nature for 40,000 years, these people. They don't have a carbon footprint. They're feeling the carbon footprint of us. And I feel it's my duty and all of our duties now to be more respectful and understanding of the other, just as Leanne talked about so eloquently this morning. And so let's work together, let's tell the stories, let's care about our planet, about people, about the others that are less fortunate. So thank you very much for having me today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to run around with this microphone with some questions. Anybody want to raise your hands? Yes.
Actually, I have two questions, but the second one is related to the first. The first one is what the political geography of the northern area in which you have been describing is very complex. There's many claims in it, political claims in it for resources. How is that affecting the scientific study and the analysis that's so important to, for example, the United Nations or international relationships that could save that area and the world itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. The geopolitical dynamics of the far north are really no different than they are here. And the biggest problem, again, is that the indigenous voices are not as loud as the powerful voices of those of us in the developed, more southern civilizations and countries, right? Indigenous people have been left out of conversations, whether it's in in Arctic Canada or in Arctic Alaska. A lot of people don't even know that we are an Arctic country, the United States, right? And by the way, when you start thinking about geopolitics and about Russia invading former parts of the Great Russian Republic or Soviet Republic, remember that Alaska was part of that expansion, right? So we're only 50 miles away from Russia. And the geopolitics are extremely complicated. There's battles within the indigenous communities up there with their indigenous corporations. Some are pro oil and gas development because they need jobs. They need things to do. They need to make money up there. They need to care for their communities. And they're seeing as things change so quickly, much like here, instead of going toward what we need to be doing, like clean energy, they're doubling down on oil and gas production and that kind of thinking. So they're split in the far north in the same way that we're split down here. Now there's tremendous indigenous voices that are developing now, which is important. We're seeing that in like the water keepers community, and we're also seeing it in the climate community. So we are seeing more indigenous and marginalized voices developing in the climate movement, in the water movement, and so that's really hopeful. And we are seeing big changes in conservation in that the arguments have changed from talking about saving the polar bears and this and that, to corporate boardrooms. Activists have taken this directly to the boardrooms across the world. Oil and gas companies and banks, especially big banks who are funding these projects. That's kind of how the politics has moved into corporate boardrooms and with shareholders. So you're starting to see more divestment. You're starting to see banks obviously be concerned about how their portfolio looks as people start shifting their investments into more sustainable growth for the future. I hope that helps a little bit. It is complicated.
Thank you for your story, and I enjoyed the Okoboji story as well. I would agree that's a great model. Can you tell us, how did Shackleton know there was a passage? I mean, we didn't have satellites and so forth, so how did he know?
Well, Shackleton was really my exploring hero from the South. Shackleton's voyage on the Endurance has been in the news recently because they were trying to go across Antarctica. Yeah, and so Amundsen and Franklin were, if you look at old maps going back all the way into the 15th century, you'll see cartographers looking at this area on top of the world, and people were just making stuff up, literally, on maps. On one map I saw, and I mean, this is a legitimate map that people look to for knowledge, they said it was the land of pygmies. They thought pygmies lived, in the area that we call the North Pole. And so there's been all of this various sort of speculation about what's been there over the years. But one thing that they knew for sure was that these great ocean voyage passages, if you think about how trade used to happen, right, long before we had steam engines, steamboats, and all this fancy travel that we have now, it was sailors. It was sailors of old who were sailing across oceans, using ocean currents, and establishing these traditional waterways as sort of the highways of transportation that we now take for granted. And so sailors knew, and investors in these sailing vessels knew, that if you had to sail from Europe up here and go all the way down like this and around Cape Horn or something to get, to Asia or wherever you were going, that this is a huge, long, very dangerous voyage. And the speculation was that since we knew the Earth was round and we were inhabiting most of the North, that there must be some passageway that would connect to Asia for shorter trading routes. So the speculation was that if you went and looked for it, it sort of must be there. And so this investigation with sailing ships really started in the 14th century, exploring. And I can tell you, almost every single one of them involved death, destruction, misery. If you read all the stories of sailors eating boots, you'll know what I mean. It was a really, really, really bad time. But that's really how it all started. It was like looking for shortcuts, ways to save fuel, ways to save men, labor, food, what have you, looking for a shortcut for trade routes. And now we have it. And in an ironic twist of history, it's not going to be the Northwest Passage that's becoming the trade route. It's the Northeast Passage. And that is the route that goes over the top of Russia, over the top of Siberia. And while we've been doing nothing, zero zilch as a country to prepare for this with any deep water ports or development in our Arctic, the Russians have developed super ports, deep water ports. They have military bases. They've built over 40 ice-breaking and ice-reinforced vessels that are prepared for the future and controlling these sea lanes. Think about that as far as national security and climate change.
I have a question. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have about 10 years to change this cycle of ecological destruction. Did you notice that the scientists on your ship, are they all getting frustrated because, they've given us all the data that we can have, but there's no action?
Yeah, the question is really, and this is one of the biggest questions that you'll hear about, right? You'll hear about a lot of progressive climate leaders in Congress or whatever, they'll say that we have 10 years left. And, you know, it's easy to take pot shots at that, right? Oh, God, we're all going to die in 10 years. No. The 10-year statistic is really about us hitting 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C here in a very short time. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but considering that the planet hasn't changed more than 4 degrees in the last 800,000 years, you start understanding the significance of this. Human civilization has developed because of stability. You can't have insurance in this day and age without actuarial charts, right, that show the kind of stability so that we can have insurance, whether it's weather, patterns that have developed, agriculture, all of this. Once we introduce the kind of instability that climate change is throwing into the system, with us destabilizing the oceans and the atmosphere, it all goes out the window. Once we hit this 1.5 C, which we're getting close to, the Earth, I had a long talk with a physicist about this. The Earth is going to change into a new physical state of existence that we can't go back to. Once we lose the stability, we can't just go back to the stability. We've destabilized the entire biosphere of planet Earth. It's taken 4.5 billion years to get to the point where we could have this conversation that we're having right now, right? And in a matter of a few decades, a few hundred years with burning fossil fuels, we're taking all of that away. So that's how imminent this is. It's not that something's just going to happen, boom, like that. You know, we're the frog in the water, right? The water's heating up, and are we going to jump out? Are we going to realize the trouble that we're in and make some kind of changes, systemic changes? Or are we just going to let it happen with our bickering and infighting that we're doing every single day? This isn't about right or left. This isn't about any kind of politics to me at all. This is about humanity. This is about all the animals. This is about the other, as we learned so eloquently about today. The Earth is about to change into a new physical state where we're not going to have any ice left in the northern pole in the summertime. It's going to be open water. And that's going to destabilize this whole polar vortex. We're already seeing that right now, right? With the wobble of the jet stream that's creating so many of these problems with wide variations in temperatures. Last year it was 100 degrees for the first time in the Arctic, in Siberia. They're having horrible fires burning there all summer long. It's on fire. In the South Pole, it went up 50 degrees above average this winter in Antarctica, and the ice sheets are being destabilized right now. It's 122 degrees in India and Pakistan right now. This is happening right now. We're seeing it every single day, and we're seeing it here in more subtle ways in Iowa, aren't we? But we all know it's happening. We're seeing the big rain events that are happening. We're seeing more precipitation. We're seeing flooding on the Mississippi. We're seeing flooding on the Missouri, and we're seeing drought in between. Boom, 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 just like this. It's just happening very quickly, and we're all seeing it. And now we have to take what we're feeling and sensing, just like George Devoki's little birds, and we need to transfer that into effective action. Yes?
Well, you just started talking about the inland and what we're experiencing, because you showed a lot of along the coastlines and the villages that are disappearing. And I went up to Fairbanks, Alaska, 7 years ago. And what I saw just appalled me. Now, this is in about the middle of Alaska, so we're far away from the seas. And I was on a bus that was taking me to the outskirts of Fairbanks, up to a museum they have there. And all the trees that were evergreens, I think, that we normally see standing erect, were like this. And that was the permafrost damage. And I'd see one like that, and I'd think, what happened to that tree? You know, maybe a storm hit it. And then we'd go along farther, and the whole forest was all like this. They were all slanted over. That was the permafrost damage. So I was just going to ask you to speak a little bit more about the inland damage that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, for sure. And it's happening along river systems. You're seeing the riverbanks are just collapsing. Great big chunks are just lopping off into the rivers. You're seeing it along the ocean where just whole cliffs are just like lopping off and falling in. And of course, all of that permafrost contains methane. Methane is sequestered into the ground in the Arctic. And methane is a greenhouse gas that's roughly 30 times stronger than CO2. It's coming up through the ocean right now because the ocean is warming, it's being released, and it's also coming out of the permafrost. And again, that cycle that I'm talking about with that positive feedback loop is opening up more of these areas for this melting and release of methane. So the more the Arctic melts, as I always say, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's going to be affecting us here and in Pacific Island areas and all over the world to all of these areas that are so vulnerable right now to sea level rise.
The fracking, isn't that mainly methane?
Yeah, well, yeah, fracking is all of the above, right? And you can't see what's being released. I live in Colorado half the year. I just can't believe the fracking that's going on out there. It's happening in suburban communities, and I mean, it's crazy what's going on with the fracking. And these wellheads, you can't see, but there's being a lot of methane released. You can only see it with certain kinds of cameras where you can photograph that. And there's a lot of these old methane wells that are capped right now, and they're not capped very well. And it's the same thing with all of this deep water oil exploration that we're doing right now. Remember the Deepwater Horizon, right? When it blew its cap off? We have tens of thousands of those capped wells in the ocean. And I can tell you, after bringing my cameras back after a year in the ocean, you don't want to buy my used equipment, even though I'd try to sell it to you for a fair price. But all my equipment would be ruined in a year. I mean, it's just gone. It's toast. The ocean is caustic. It just erodes everything. And so we have all these ticking time bombs all over the planet right now. And so, again, you know, we're playing a Ponzi scheme on Mother Earth. And Mother Earth is coming back with a vengeance. And again, we're like this on the planet. The planet's been here a lot longer than we have. And just like Chief Dana said here, right? They really feel so responsible as human beings for the kind of stewardship and care for this planet in a deeper ecological way than we do. They understand our impact and that we don't really deserve to be here as a species if we're not capable of being good stewards and taking care of this planet for the next generations. And we need to learn from that kind of mentality in order for us to save what we have here, to save this beautiful creation. One more?
One more.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay.
That's sort of a special guest.
I'm Charles Knicker from Ames, and I'll just say we just finished last weekend. We had a theologian in residence program. We had Brooks Barrett from the UCC office there, a theologian. And for that registration, which became a national webinar, we had 700 registrations. I want to follow up on your question about Iowa and wind and solar. And I'm saying this because actually about 3 weeks ago, April 11th, it was a Monday, Senator Joni Ernst was at the Ames Noon Rotary Club. And I asked her a question about climate, and particularly we were concerned about ethanol. And her comment was, well, I'm open to all forms of energy.
All of the above.
All of the above, yes. And then she kept coming back to ethanol. So how do we respond to our senator and senators about can they get off of that and get on to solar and wind?
Well, first of all, I don't think that we really can get back to them as effectively as large fossil fuel donors are and large, corporate agricultural donors are to their campaigns, and we don't even know how much money they're getting or where it's coming from. There could even be Russian money involved now in crypto, for all we know. We don't know. And so how is someone like me, a visual artist and an explorer with no money to give to that kind of person, that candidate, supposed to effectively communicate these kinds of concerns? And I think the only way that we can do it is en masse. We just have to, as people, all of us, in an overwhelming way, communicate with our representatives in every way that we can to start showing them that this is not a viable future. Ethanol is destroying the state of Iowa. It is absolutely destroying the waters. I mean, we had the nutrient reduction strategy developed in 2013, 10 years ago, and not only have we not come close to hitting those targets, by the way, these are targets that every farmer and the Iowa Farm Bureau and Iowa Corn Growers Association, everybody's been trying to hit. Not only have we not hit them, it's gotten worse by magnitudes. And now, with this big push to produce more, right, as Joni and Chuck and others want, more energy from corn, which is not efficient to produce additives to fossil fuels, it's just going to exacerbate the climate change issue, extend the life of fossil fuels, and sequestering carbon from the production of ethanol is the craziest Ponzi scheme I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, Bruce Ranstetter stands to make $650 million a year from the federal government in subsidies. That is the only reason he's interested in this project. He's never said one thing about climate change or being interested in climate change. And I challenge you to find one of these politicians who's saying that they're concerned about climate change if the only thing that they're interested in is carbon sequestration pipelines for ethanol. So we have to challenge our candidates on all of these issues. Clean energy is there for the taking right now. I mean, Iowa could be the first state. It is right there for the taking, and it's so much more efficient, and farmers could make more money, quite frankly, with solar and a different kind of footprint out on their land with solar energy, clean energy, outdoor recreation, wildlife, trails, prairie grasses. You can have carbon sequestration in all kinds of ways, right? You can have all kinds of, wetlands are one, but there's the other wetland kind of sequestration project that you can build in around your tiles, right? So what's it called? The name's escaping me right now. That's it. It's a saturated buffer. And I've about talked myself out here into a circle, but right. So there's all of these systems around that we can do, these conservation practices we know with agriculture that work. And we need to start using the most productive land in the world to grow food. We import 90% of our food back into Iowa because we aren't growing food that people eat. So we're actually a food desert here in the state of Iowa. Think about that. A good friend of mine, Chris Jones, posted the other day, he's been great, by the way. He's one of the great University of Iowa scientists, and I'll close with this. We used to grow apples in the state of Iowa, right? And he said that we grow, I don't know, something like, do you know Channing? It was like, he left maybe. We only grow a few thousand apples now, like commercially, and we used to grow hundreds and hundreds of thousands of apples in the state of Iowa. And it's the same. You can go through with all kinds of vegetables. We used to have gardens and victory gardens, and we used to grow food that we eat, and we need to start getting back to that. And so supporting local growers and helping develop small farms that young farmers can get doing to produce food that we can actually eat here in the state of Iowa would help a lot. But number one, we've got to be lighter footprint on our water systems in the state of Iowa, and that's going to involve regulation, and this voluntary approach just isn't working. So that's a roundabout way to answer your question, but we need to stay on our elected officials and communicate any way we can. So, and I'll be happy to answer any more questions. I'm going to hang around for a while. I'll be out there by the gallery, and I do have a few books left over here if anybody's interested. And so I thank you all very, very much for coming today, and thank you so much, Amy, and all of you here at Plymouth Church.
Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much.